Hi, this is John Rowell for the Rowell Report. Today is Wednesday, November 12th, 2025, and I found this article from the U.S. Army War College publications from June 18th, 2025. It's, about 5 months ago or so. So it is a bit in the, down the line from recent articles. But I think the real important part of this is the discussion of a just peace in Ukraine. And so I give credit to the authors, Nathaniel B. Davis and Marlon A. Thomas, and to at least make the effort to try to find how you apply just war principles to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But the real problem of this article is really the whole problem of the U.S. military. And the U.S. military is an instrument of global domination by a U.S.-led hegemony. So if you have all of your ideas about just war within that sphere, then you're going to come up with conclusions which only make sense within that bubble. So that is the real problem of this article that I'm seeing, and I think that the people in the military are very aware of their usefulness, their ideas, and their usefulness within this military-industrial complex, and that is they're only useful when they support, further the ideas and the goals of this military-industrial complex. So you're probably aware that people who are in the military, once they've finished their tour of duty, and they either decide to continue in the military or in the military-industrial complex or in a think tank or possibly in politics, is that now they are a veteran, and as a veteran, their purpose is to support the goals and the ideology of the military-industrial complex. So you can see that very clearly in this article, and it is a very long article. I don't know how many words it is, but it's very long, so I won't go through it word by word, especially because I want to keep this video short. But I think the most important thing is, what is a just war, and how do you apply principles of a just war if you presuppose a series of conditions and attributes to the various parties which are basically only real within this bubble, which I'm talking about is the bubble of this U.S.-controlled hegemony, in which the U.S. determines what is good, what is bad, the military actions that they can carry out, the military actions they need to carry out. So within all that bubble, you develop something that is called the national security and the national security priorities. I know that they're working on what are the priorities for national security. But basically, when you are a global hegemony, everywhere is national security. So Iraq is national security, Afghanistan is national security, Libya's national security, Syria's national security, the Palestinian people who have been displaced from their land, and they have been harassed and killed with impunity. They only fit within the scheme of things within the national security priority, which is basically Israel. So you can see that just war and the principle of human rights really is manipulated so much within that bubble that it's no longer understandable unless you are from that perspective. And so if you tried to explain to someone in Africa why the United States needed to go into Iraq and be there for, I don't know what it was, 20 years or so. Why does the U.S. need to go in Iraq? Why does the U.S. have national security priorities and interest in Iraq? Then you go to them and say the U.S. is a benevolent country and we control this network which maintains democracy and human rights. And the person is like, yeah, I've heard that before from the European imperialists who had split up Africa into all these different countries and made, arbitrary lines separating one area from another, all to support their imperialistic aims. And so within that, anyone who opposed them was an evildoer, needed to be eliminated or controlled, needed to be dominated. So, the person in Africa is going to say, hey, this is starting to sound a little bit like those European guys who showed up and they were, so they said, no, but here is a dictator, and they said, how did you know he was a dictator? Didn't they have elections in Iraq? But they were all controlled by, it was just like a one-party system and they all controlled it and there was no democracy. And then the person in Africa could say, well, wasn't that one party, didn't they have people within that one party competing for different positions? So in a sense, there was a democratic process going on. And how do we know that he was a ruthless dictator that controlled and was, and creating a lot of bad situations for the people when it was the embargo from the United States that led to the deaths of the people in Iraq and not Saddam Hussein, when they say, well, that's your opinion and blah, blah, blah. Well, anyway, once you get out of the sphere of the U.S., Canada, Europe, I guess now you can include in Iceland, Japan, Australia, Singapore. Once you get out of all those little, areas, then you start to realize, hey, there's another way to look at the world than from the perspective of the U.S. hegemony. Because from the perspective of U.S. hegemony, everywhere on the planet is a national security interest for the United States, even Ukraine. So, and you could ask someone, hey, so let's say Russia has a good relationship with Mexico, and they're going to have Russian troops on the border with the United States, maybe 100,000, not a big number, maybe 500,000, no, not too many, and they're going to have missiles set up. They could be nuke or non-nuke. They could reach Washington, they could reach Seattle, they could reach Chicago. But don't worry, it's not a problem. They're just there to maintain the peace and keep human rights going and all that. And so that would be acceptable to you, right? Because if Russia has national security interest in Mexico, why can't they have, 1 million troops, nuclear weapons pointing at Washington? They're not there to cause a war or anything. They're the most benevolent people who just help everyone. So, and they say, no, you can't do that. Russia can't have national security interests in Mexico or Canada or Greenland or Hawaii. But the U.S. can have national security interests in Ukraine. So, you start to see conflicts of, logic and errors in thinking. And I just want to go back to this article here. A more perfect peace. Can the Russia-Ukraine war end justly? Well, when you get into this bubble, this thinking, this hegemonic thinking that the U.S. is the world cop, and they can destroy countries, they can bomb anyone at any time for any reason, because in the end, everything the United States does is just and right and for the good of the humanity and for the planet. When you come from that point of view, then you get an article like this. And this article it just, breathes propaganda infused, half-truths and all sorts of lame, illogical conclusions that only make sense within this thinking. So I just go down this article, and it talks about evolving goals, and here it says, determining Russian goals at any point can be difficult, as they are often ill-defined and communicated in an information space rife with Russian disinformation efforts. So Russia communicated before the invasion of Ukraine. Russia communicated what it wanted. It wanted the ethnic Russian people in Ukraine who were being mistreated by the nationalist Ukrainians who didn't want Russian language, Russian culture, Russian Orthodox Church, that was shelling Luhansk, shelling Donetsk. It was wiping out the leadership of their independence movements. It was carrying out terrorist attacks. So anyway, when that happened, President Putin said, what we can do is we will the ethnic Russian people who want to conserve their language and their culture and their religion, they should be able to exercise and live their culture and their language and their all that within Ukraine. So Ukraine should be able to respect that. So you can give them autonomy in order to be able to do that, and that you will still have all this territory. And so the first effort of Russia was to try to mend the differences between the two sides. The ethnic Russian Ukrainians who had rebelled against the ultra-nationalist Ukrainians that were in Kiev, that were installed by the United States. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the U.S. installed that government. You can go to many videos which have the audio of the U.S. officials picking out as the democratically elected government in Kiev was falling. The U.S. officials were already picking out who was going to be the president, vice president, who was going to be in the cabinet, and all that. So we know that it was a U.S. installed puppet regime. So that puppet regime was instructed by Washington to try to expunge Ukraine of anything that was Russian. So they were carrying that out with gusto. And the ethnic Russian Ukrainians said, no, we're not going to tolerate that. And so there was a civil war. So have you heard of a civil war? Was there a civil war in the United States? Yes, there was a civil war. Does that mean that if one side was rebelling against another, it was somehow, was it somehow not a civil war? No, the Civil War in the United States was a civil war. And it lasted, about 5 years, and ended with the defeat of the South and so states' rights were destroyed, and we had federalism. And so anyway, the point is that countries can fall into civil wars. And so the first thing we had in Ukraine was a civil war. Russia and first tried to, they spent 8 years from 2014 to 2022 trying to negotiate, convince the officials in Kiev to respect the rights of the ethnic Russians, and that whole process failed because the U.S., which had installed the puppet government, would not permit the Kiev government to accept. Also, there were many neo-Nazi groups that were there, and they along with the ultranationalists, created an atmosphere of hatred towards all Russians, anything Russian. It was in the schools, in the universities, in the workplace. It was in the government. It was everywhere. So what Russia tried to do was convince them. They had to tone that down. They had to allow for the ethnic Russians to live as normal human beings, and to live out their God-given right to determine, to have self-determination. So anyway, make a long story short, the Russian goal was always to preserve the rights of the ethnic Russians. Now it became very clear right before the special military operation that that Ukraine would eventually have U.S. missiles, and the U.S. would not tell Russia what kind of missiles they would have, whether they would be nuclear or non-nuclear. And so that was the second problem. Okay, so the first problem was securing the rights of the ethnic Russians, and the ethnic Russian Ukrainians living in Ukraine under their own self-determination decided that they were going to fight to preserve their rights, and if they needed to, they were going to declare independence. So anyway, so within this scenario, the Russians first tried to convince the Kiev regime to accept the rights of the ethnic Russians. Within that scenario, Kiev basically, Ukraine basically was intact except Crimea. So there was no territory loss. There would have been business as usual between the United States and Ukraine. But no, they would not respect the rights of the ethnic Russians who lived in Ukraine, who were Ukrainians. And the United States, which had carried out a coup to remove a democratically elected government, would not commit to any clarity in the missiles that they wanted to put in Ukraine. So, I mean, the red flags were waving, and so Russia carried out what for them is a just war, because this area borders Russia and is very close to Moscow. This is their national security. So you can see now the conflicting hegemonic national security, which everywhere is our national security, and Russia only focusing on the actual national security interest on their borders. And so you can see that there's the two different narratives, the Russian narrative and the NATO US narrative, using Ukraine to try to install NATO in Ukraine. So anyway, so we go back to this article here, and I go back to this phrase: determining Russian goals at any point can be difficult, as they are ill-defined. When were they ill-defined? Okay, so the first thing is, if you're going to write an article in the Wall Street Journal or the Economist or the New York Times, there are certain things you need to say about Russia in order to have your article published and to be accepted. Now, if you were in a think tank, there would be a particular cultural ethos within those organizations, and there's certain absolute tenets which you must uphold, or you can't be a part of those organizations. So going back to the United States, this hegemonic organization which has national security interests basically anywhere in the planet, basically Uncle Sam tells and you do. So and the real problem going back, how is anyone in the United States going to publish an article about just wars and how to end just wars and how to find a perfect peace, whatever they come up with all these funny phrases? How are you going to determine that if you never give any validation to the national security interest of another country? They have a principle called indivisibility, where the national security interest of one country can't be upheld at the expense of the national security interest of another country. So, and also we have a very important principle called the self-determination of peoples. Isn't that why the United States had its revolution to become independent from the British Empire? Because it wanted to free itself from the territorial integrity of the British Empire. So was the American Revolution unjust because we violated the territorial integrity of the British Empire? So, you start to ask yourself questions and put it into other scenarios, and you realize, these people, Nathaniel Davis, Marlon Thomas, they probably know differently. They probably know better. But they know if they ever want to get a job in a think tank, they're going to have to put out this same drivel that's put out by every other publication that promotes the U.S. hegemonic position. So they need to repeat this. They need to have clear that there are certain untouchables. Ukraine is this sovereign democratic nation upholding human rights that was doing nothing really wrong, and suddenly the Russians invaded. It says in here that the war in Ukraine was a choice. Well, Russia had no choice. It had no choice. It couldn't allow NATO to be installed in Ukraine and to then put in possibly nukes next to its border, which could fly to Moscow in less than 5 minutes. And the fact that no one in the establishment in the United States and all these think tanks and the military colleges and all these places, the fact that they can't even get their head around that and consider that as a valid reason for Russia to go in to carry out their special military operation is just absurd. It's absurd that the U.S. taxpayer is paying money to the government, which supports these colleges, to come up with the most insane and absurd drivel that and this is why the U.S. goes into Afghanistan, goes into Iraq. This is why the U.S. was in Vietnam, and it's just a treadmill. The treadmill keeps going. You just put a new guy on there. In the 60s, it was some think tanks and individuals, the CIA, the State Department, the Department of Defense or Department of War, and they're all pushing these narratives, and the U.S. taxpayer is paying them to put out lies, half-truths, to deceive them, to put out propaganda. So you can see this self-perpetuating scenario, which is being carried out, is eventually going to carry the U.S. to be involved in a conflict from which it cannot extricate itself, and they will tangle with somebody. They will punch somebody in the nose who has a sledgehammer and will whack them until they no longer are able to think clearly, all because they continue to go down this path of this expansionary U.S. hegemonic policy. The U.S. has to expand. Now Trump wants to bring the U.S. into Central Asia, into Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and Turkmenistan and all these countries. You can see it's an unending. They just can't fathom that there is a point where they need to stop. And all this is wasted money, it's wasted resources. If you drive on a highway in the United States and you see, the potholes haven't been fixed, the roads haven't been painted, there's no lighting, the roads are dark, and there's rocks everywhere on the road, and they're kicked up by trucks and they crack our windshield. It's just this infrastructure which is not being taken care of. Why? Because all the money goes to all these foreign wars, all these foreign conflicts, all these perceived national security interests, which are just imaginary, made up by somebody in a think tank who then went on to work, in a military-industrial complex company like Lockheed Martin or Boeing, and then that person went on to run for the Senate or the House of Representatives, and then that person, it's just this cycle of people coming in all of these different parts, and you think that they would have a different perspective, that they would provide the U.S. with leadership, but no, they're all just repeating the same dribble and coming up with the same bad solutions. And so this article, I think, is a pretty clear indication of the lack of any intelligent thought going on in our military-industrial complex, in the government, and the think tanks. That they're only pushing one set of narratives, and they'll just beat it to death until they're out of money and the country has got itself into a conflict from which it cannot extricate itself. So anyway, we have this last subheading, A More Perfect Peace. It is unlikely that Russia will accept every aspect of a just peace. So first of all, who determines what is a just peace? And what is it that they have to accept? They're fighting a war on their border for their national security. This isn't about some just peace idea, especially considering that they're fighting with a regime in Kiev who is installed and maintained and perpetuated by the United States. So it is unlikely that Russia will accept every aspect of a just peace. So really, the only just peace that works for individuals like these authors and people in this whole bubble is whatever works for the national security interest. That is a just peace, because the U.S. is a democratic nation. We protect democracies, we foster democracies, we build them up, we support them, and basically these are all just puppet governments who are carrying out the goals of the U.S. hegemonic empire. And says, for example, at the point of accommodation, Russia may be willing to trade de jure recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea and Donbass for a formal peace treaty and Ukraine's accession to NATO. What kind of an idiot, excuse the language, what kind of an idiot thinks that Russia would ever accept NATO in Ukraine? What kind of an idiot? They've already said, basically for a very long time, that they were concerned about the expansion of NATO and it moving to their borders. You can say, well, they didn't complain about NATO in Estonia or, well, Russia is not concerned about Estonia. And they said, what about Finland? Well, Russia isn't concerned about Finland either. So Ukraine is a problem because the Ukrainian people have been turned against their own best interests. They were convinced to commit national suicide in the interest of the United States and its hegemonic allies, basically to further the goals of the United States. So I wouldn't think that Finland would allow the installation of weapons into its territory, nuke weapons or even non-nukes. So I think Russia needed to put the brake on the NATO expansion, especially on its western border, and considering that part of Ukraine was actually a part of Russia until 1920, and Crimea is a vital national security interest for access to the Black Sea. They had to put their foot down in Ukraine. So, when somebody is, basically these people, these two authors of this article, are trying to convince think tanks that they are good candidates to be like junior members because they think the same as those people do. And once they get into the think tank, then they can think about, running for office or going to Lockheed Martin. And, these are all interchangeable parts. They all think the same, do the same, and you move them around and you basically get the same result. So anyway, I think I've gone way over. I'm almost to the longest video I've put out, 32 minutes, almost 33. So anyway, I would encourage you to go to this article, see all the half-truths, all the lies, all the propaganda, all the U.S. hegemonic thinking that's in this, and consider what's the whole purpose of this article. I mean, if they were going to think about just peace, they need to think outside the box and not within the strict confines of U.S. national security interests. But basically, you can't think that way and write that and hope that you will ever have a chance of getting a position in a university or a think tank or run for office, because they'll just say you're Russian stooges, and with that people say, I don't want to have anything to do with you. So anyway, that is my report for today. I'll stop before I get to 34 minutes. So thanks again for joining me. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe and share. Bye-bye.